Good evening. I'm truly thrilled about tonight's two public seminars by Professor Seth Marder from Georgia Institute of Technology and Professor George Whitesides from Harvard University. Professor Marder and Professor Whitesides will talk about their careers and the hurdles they faced, the challenges they overcame, the lessons they learned, the impactful decisions they took, and the approaches they adopted to face all of these obstacles. These two public talks will, with no doubt, relate to many of you. Academic advising goes beyond giving alternate pens. It's about creating new opportunities and shedding light on new paths. These talks are just one aspect. It's my honor now to introduce one of the greatest chemists, to introduce Professor George Whitesides. Professor Whitesides is the Woodford L&N.A. Flowers University professor at Harvard University. I didn't talk much about the Professor Marder's CV because I knew he's going to talk about it. And I'm not going to mention much about Professor Whitesides' accomplishments. I'm going to just mention one thing, that he received just 11 honorary doctorate degrees. Professor Whitesides, the floor is yours.
What is it to be a professor? I have no clue. I've been doing it for a long time, but I'm not about to be able to tell you the answer to that. I will say it's, in some senses, an ill-posed question. So it's a little bit like, what's it to be a mammal? And there are lots of different flavors of mammal. One thing I will start with, just to sort of frame discussion, is that it turns out that there are a couple of different approaches to making a living in life. There are people who think for a living, and then there are people who do for a living. They execute or think. And the two are different in style and experience, but mostly you can't do both of them usually well at the same time. People who are good executors make decisions and go and do stuff on instinct. And then people who are thinkers spend a lot of time thinking, but they usually don't have the resources to actually do anything. So the question is, do you like to think about stuff or do you like to do stuff? And then there are others who don't like to do either, and that's okay too, but that's not what we're going to talk about. So in thinking about this discussion briefly, because I'm not going to claim to have given a lot of thought to it, what I thought I would do is to look back, I will look back over experiences in my life and try to pick out a few things that I think are maybe useful lessons. You know, what happened and what did it lead to? Let me start by saying that I come from the central part of the United States, which is a little bit hard scrabble. That is, it's not wealthy. The educational system basically stinks. And I was raised in a background which had a very useful characteristic. It was a farming background, although we weren't farmers. The characteristic was that in the morning, family would get up, the mother would feed the dogs and the children, and then push them out of doors. And then in the evening, the dogs and the children would come back in, and the mother would feed the dogs and the children would be washed and put to bed, and the dogs would just be put to bed. And that was it. The parents had no idea what we were doing during the day, not a clue. So what were we doing? Well, one of the nice things about where I lived was that there was a railroad line that was the Louisville and Nashville, the L&N Railroad. And I used to walk back and forth along this to school. And I spent years trying to do the following experiment, which was, the trains would come, and the question was, if you put a big rock on the rail, could you derail the train? I was profoundly interested in this question. And I tried it over and over and over again, and it turns out that I couldn't. I never derailed a train. But what did happen was that as the train would come along, it would either crush the rock or the rock would be spit out from the rail and embed itself, halfway into a tree. And the thing that was amazing about this was I never killed myself. Also, I never did anything there. But what I think was interesting about that in retrospect is that I was very happy doing this. No one told me to do it. It was really quite stupid and dangerous. And I think those are good things to start with if you're thinking about a life, whether it's professor or not, which is dominated by curiosity. So that went on for a while. And I went through high school. I was not very good at that. I was a failed student athlete. I really was pretty undistinguished in almost any way. My mother was almost a Christian Scientist, and she didn't believe in wearing glasses. She thought that if I drank a lot of water, my eyes would get better. They didn't. But one interesting characteristic of this was that, of course, that was in the days in which everything was up on the blackboard, but I never saw what was on the blackboard. So for the first 7 or 8 years of school, I had no idea what anyone was talking about. It didn't seem to make a lot of difference, so it's okay. So eventually I went to school. And when I entered college, and I was distinguished at that point by only one characteristic, which was that I was selected to be one of the 10 worst spellers in the entire entering class. And I was sentenced to remedial spelling, to which I never went. And that's okay, because along came Microsoft Word, 50 years later, so I'd never had to learn how to spell. But so, these important life skills, like can you do arithmetic? Well, I still add on my fingers. Can you spell anything? I've never been able to spell anything. Can you see what's on the board? I can't see anything that's on the board. Are you a profoundly athletic and distinguished person? No, none of this. Don't worry about any of it. That's not important. So I went from there to, there was an important thing that happened then, and I'll come back to it. But, you go to college and you want to do something with yourself that's somehow distinguished. And this was in a period in the beginning days of the Cold War when it was a physics-based world. And I think we all had math envy. We wanted to be smarter than everyone else, and the way you got to be smarter than everyone else was to be a mathematician. And we were required to go to the department chairman at the end of a year of whatever we were going to concentrate in and declare a major. So I went to see the head of the math department, and I said, Professor Gleason, good news, I'm going to be a math major. And Professor Gleason said, well, that's a very nice, young man. May I ask you a question or two? And I said, yes. Of course, Professor Gleason. He said, do you like mathematics? I said, oh, yes. He said, are you good at it? I said, I'm pretty good at it, okay. He said, do you like the examinations? Yes, I like the examinations. He said, do you work at this? And I said, yes. He said, forget it. And I said, forgive me. And he said, look, young man, the only reason, if you have had anything in any course that you've taken that's of any interest to you at all, you do not have the ability to be a mathematician. We only give these courses for stupid math majors. The only thing you could possibly be is an applied mathematician. Go find something useful to do with your life. So that was mathematics. However, there was a good outcome from this, which came up a couple of years later. I then thought about being an English major because I liked reading, but I decided that you couldn't possibly make a living at it. I have no particular interest to be rich, and I have absolutely no interest in being poor, so that didn't seem like a good option. However, my father had been a chemical engineer, and I'd started life basically as a technician, washing dishes. Turns out I actually quite like washing dishes. I mean, you start with a sink full of dirty dishes, and you end up with a pegboard full of clean dishes, and that's very satisfying. And there is, I think, a second lesson in that. First, have parents who just leave you alone. But the second lesson is that it's good to start something in which you like the little details. You know, if you like the grand picture but you don't like the little stuff, it doesn't work out so well. If you like actually doing the little stuff, then it's good to like the big details, but you're basically okay anyway. So I liked washing dishes, so I ended up, you know, going to chemistry lab, which was very easy. So I ended up being a chemist. I applied to Berkeley, and I didn't hear from them, but that didn't bother me very much. And then the summer went on. I was going to be a graduate student. The summer went on, and I still didn't hear from them. And I applied again, and I still didn't hear from them. And I was getting a little worried because it was whatever. And finally, I just out of whim, I called up Caltech and I said, look, I have a fellowship. I don't have any place to go. Can I go to Caltech? They said, why not? So, you know, in times of stress, do something improbable. So I called them up and that was all fine. I went and ended up working with a guy named Jack Roberts. And I think that in the course of my PhD thesis, I probably talked to my research director, Jack Roberts, for upwards of 7 or 8 minutes, but certainly not more than that. And we had very few interactions. I would write papers, he would correct them. There was one very healthy interaction that occurred in which he had an idea for a particular experiment. And he came to me all excited that he had this idea for the experiment. And I was able to tell him that yes, it was a pretty good idea, and I'd actually done it 6 months earlier. And then he left me alone after that, because we'd established a relationship which was a working relationship. But I got all finished with this, and I wrote my thesis, and I had to go off and go to work. The only problem was I realized in about the 1st of August that the thesis was completely wrong. I mean, it was just wrong. And so what does this have to do with anything? And it has to do with the fact that I was able to make it right for the reason that all of that math that I took enabled me to read some weird papers in Israeli physics journals, which actually settled the problem for me, and so it was fixed. And the point that I would make from that is that if you're interested in thinking for a living, you have no idea where you will be able to use knowledge. So just scoop it up, wherever it comes from, learn everything you possibly can, because you'll turn out, amazingly enough, to use everything at some point. I mean, being a sort of a whale going through a sea of krill, all information is good and useful. So I went off to MIT, which was a great place to start. And a very interesting thing happened there, which was I was a chemist in the chemistry department. And I started to go to chemistry lectures. And I thought that I'd never heard anything as boring in my life. It was just appalling. I just didn't care about this stuff at all. So looking around, I went off to the chemical engineering department, where I started to just go to the chemical engineering lectures, and that was a lot of fun. But it was interesting enough that, you know, the chemical engineers were sort of puzzled by who this child was that would come in and sit in the front row and ask stupid questions. And after a while, the department chairman said, who are you and why are you here? And I explained, and he said, well, okay, that's sort of nice. We've never had a chemist. Why don't you come over and spend a sabbatical here? Which I did. And from that came all kinds of useful things. I learned about mass transport and heat equations, and I learned how to work with fluids and this and that. I also learned how to cost things and how to keep them from blowing up. Some of this I've used and some of it I've not used. But the lesson that I would suggest from that, and it's come up over and over again, is if you have a choice, somebody comes and gives you an opportunity, don't think, just say yes and do it. Because what will happen is that, you know, there'll be things that work and there are things that don't work, but the things that don't work are almost never going to be fatal, and every once in a while one of them will work, and from that will come a lot of good stuff. Now, what came from chemical engineering? Well, a couple of years later, in the early 70s, I guess, there was a phrase in the air. You know, now you hear a sort of buzzword of Internet of Things, and you hear about artificial intelligence and deep learning. What are they? I don't know. But in those days, the idea that was sort of floating around was biotechnology. And biotechnology didn't make any sense because biology was biology and technology was technology, and what did this mean? So what do you do if you're in the National Science Foundation? The answer is you call up the chairman of the chemical engineering department at MIT and you say, we don't know what it is, but it seems to be happening. Let us give you a lot of money and you figure it out. So to do that, you have to have a proposal. And so he put together a very rational proposal. And just apparently 2 days before they were going to send it off, the person who was supposed to be the enzymologist disappeared. I don't know what happened to him. And so literally what he did was to go to the chemistry department phone book, and he started to make telephone calls, starting with the letter B, and saying, we don't know what we're doing, but we'll give you some money if you'd like to join us in this. And W, I note, is at the end of the alphabet, which said that these very bright, rational people all said, no, we don't want to do that, we have careers to attend to. And I said, yes. So that's lesson number 2 in yes. Now, what came of that? What came of that is I learned everything in the world about fermentation engineering and how you run an airlift reactor and all kinds of things of this kind. And does one care? Well, what came of that was that a little bit later it turned out that in Washington they needed to find some people who actually could do chemistry, could do chemical engineering, knew something about biology and, you know, this kind of stuff. So there weren't that many of them around. So because of this sort of random motion, I was there and they said, why don't you come and help us on a series of problems, which at that point were problems in the Department of Defense. And I said, I would love to do that. And what came of that was that I got to meet and be taught by some of the most amazing people I know, none of whom had anything at all to do with university. And there was a guy who was the CEO of Martin Marietta, the ex-head of DARPA, the head of Merck. I mean, there was just this collection of people who were working for the government. And it turns out that if you are young, and you have this great advantage, older people love to teach younger people. So if possible, stay young forever. This is good advice. But regardless of whether you can do that or not, try to be the youngest person in the room. Because what happens is that you get all the instruction that way. So do that. So things proceeded and we developed a research program. And can I learn anything from that? And yes, there is an important lesson from that as well. And that is that we have a method in the research group for developing new ideas, which is we get together and we think of things that might be interesting. And then after we've thought about this for a while, the students go off and they do a literature search. And they come back and they're very happy because they have this big stack of, you know, interesting literature. And I look at it and I say, lots of interesting literature? They say yes. I say, we're not interested. Because if other people have worked on it, we don't do it. And the reason for that is I'm intrinsically profoundly lazy. And I do not like to work on stuff that other people have worked on, because then you have to read the literature. And I don't like reading the literature. I'm not interested in what other people have done in general. So, you know, the point there is that I would say is that if you're interested in thinking for a living, don't spend your time thinking about what other people have already thought about. Go think about what people haven't thought about. It makes a big difference. Now, sort of the last of these lessons came in the, I don't know, 90s sometime, when I had a secretary, a woman named Giselle Weiss, who the students used to say that her IQ was the product of all the other IQs in the group. She was incredibly smart. And she and my wife, who is also very smart, and one of the graduate students who was there, looked at me and I think decided that I was fundamentally defective work. And they decided to teach me how to do my job. And what they taught me was that a research group is not actually intended to do research. A research group is a social organization. And that what you're actually doing, if you're managing it, is to try to figure out what the people in the group are themselves actually interested in, and then to try to help them do whatever that is. But by the way, along the way, you entangle their interests with yours so that they're doing what you're interested in, they're doing what they're interested in, and everybody's very happy. And that's a really important thing to consider, not for the present, because you got to get there, but ultimately people make a transition pretty seamlessly from doing technical detail to doing management, where they help other people do technical detail. And it turns out that if you have even a grain of sense, it's easy to pick research problems. That's never a problem. But getting people to work on them in a way that's productive and interesting can be actually quite a worthwhile and challenging thing to do. So what do I conclude from this? And that is that one lesson is that if you like thinking, being a professor is great work, because you get to do both thinking and work with people. That's good. Teaching is nice, but teaching is just a form of working with people. A second thing is that I look at all of this and I ask if there's a common theme, and the common theme is I hate having a boss. I just can't stand having somebody who can tell me what to do. And that, I realized, was a character defect from very early on. So if you don't like having a boss, it's a good job. If you do like having a boss and you do like having people tell you what to do, that's okay too, but it's not clear that that's a good thing to do if you're a professor. I just don't think it works that well. The third lesson is do everything you can to put yourself in new situations, because they will generate opportunities, and whenever there's an opportunity, say yes. And I think one of the things that it's easy to do is to do, in every case, a kind of cost-benefit analysis. If you do a cost-benefit analysis, you will always conclude that it's better not to do something. So don't think about it. Don't take that point of view. Just do it and figure it out later. I mean, it will get you in a lot more trouble, but you'll have a lot more fun. And then the last thing is, remember that when you're working in an organization, they're not working for you, you're working for them. And if you have smart people, it isn't hard to find problems. People worry about, can I find research problems? There are an infinite number of research problems around. But getting people engaged so that what you and they are doing collectively is good for them, gets them where they want to be, that actually requires some skill. And it's very, very interesting. But it's, it's a slightly different slant on things. Now I'll tell you, to finish, just one phrase that drives me berserk. And that is that students will occasionally come to me and I say, look, you say you want to go to Stanford to be a professor. I think that's terrific, but you actually have to get something done. It's not enough just to exist. And they say, well, that's fine, but I'm worried about the work-life balance. And I was amused to have a student say this, who wanted to go to the material science department at MIT. And I went to my friends in material science department at MIT, and I said, this guy would like to have a work-life balance, and he would like to go to work in your department. They said, well, that's absolutely terrific. Tell him he can either have a work or he can have a life, in the sense that he means, but he can't have both. But please understand what that means. Work-life balance, in that context, what he was thinking of was that he would like to work from 9 to 5, and then he'd like to come home and have politically oriented arguments over dinner with good friends. You just don't have time to do that. And if you like thinking for a living, it's so interesting that it's actually much more interesting than having politically oriented conversations with your friends, because normally you've heard their opinions on these subjects before anyway. So the great virtue of being a professor is you get to do what's the most amusing thing that I know, which is think for a living. about whatever happens to be curious to you, if you happen to be curious. And don't worry about the rest of it. It all takes care of itself. I was actually a hockey coach for years. And my kids are terrific. And I get along with my wife. So I don't know whether that corresponds to work life, but trying to figure out how you shave corners to do something you actually don't want to do anyway is not a very sensible thing to do. But so do it, do what other people are not doing, do it because you like doing it, and don't worry about all this stuff that you get told about balances and plus minuses and stuff like that. Just go do it. You'll have so much more fun that way. Say so, that's all.
Thank you very much for this inspiring talk. May I,
It wasn't inspiring.
It was.
It was
I
instructive.
call Professor Whitesides, Professor Marder, and Professor Haddadin to the stage. We're going to give both Professor Marder and Professor Whitesides a small token of appreciation, which is simply the announcement of your seminar.
This is, I'm sorry, this is a...
Thank you.
That's one.
Take both.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
we do that? My wife will be happy.
Let's do it the right way.
Thank you very much. Thank you, guys. Thank you.